On November 10, 1995, a tragic event shook the nation of Nigeria and sent shockwaves around the world. Author and activist Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 men from the Ogoni community in the Niger Delta were unlawfully executed by the Sani Abacha-led military dictatorship. Ken Saro-Wiwa's death, along with that of 8 other activists in the movement for the survival of the Ogoni People, MOSOP, catapulted the Ogoni plight to global awareness. The Ogoni Nine, as they became known, were victims of an alleged conspiracy between Shell Oil and the Nigerian military dictatorship headed by General Sani Abacha to silence both MOSOP and Ken Saro-Wiwa. At the time, Saro-Wiwa had become one of the most vocal critics of oil exploitation in Nigeria and the environmental costs to the Ogoni people. In this episode of African Biographics, we cover the life and legacy of this remarkable man, Nigeria's Ken Saro-Wiwa, his activism against the Nigerian state, as well as his defiant stance in the face of his illegal and immoral execution. The first oil discovery in Nigeria came in November 1908 during the first petroleum exploration in the country at Lekki Lagoon on the eastern edge of modern-day Lagos State. Nigeria Bitumen, the first company to prospect for oil, made this discovery but could not prevent water seepage into the oil field due to technological constraints. This inhibited their ability to produce oil in commercial quantities. This first discovery of oil in Nigeria was also the first recorded case of an oil spill in the country. The 1950s saw one of the most important developments for the future of Nigeria, which was the discovery of rich petroleum deposits in the Niger Delta. With production commencing in 1958, this set the stage for a growing industry that would soon attract numerous foreign oil companies. As Nigeria gained independence and faced the challenges of a young nation, the oil sector played a crucial role in its economic development. Oil rigs dotted the landscape and pipelines crisscrossed the nation, transporting crude oil to domestic refineries and international markets. The expansion of the petroleum industry in Nigeria accelerated after the Nigerian Civil War in 1970. However, this dependence on oil transformed Nigeria into a rentier state, prioritizing the support of the oil sector's economic interests above maintaining a functioning and functional state apparatus. Nigeria's growing reliance on oil also brought about significant challenges. As government revenues came to depend almost exclusively on the petroleum sector, the Niger Delta, including Ogoni Land, where Ken Saro-Wiwa came from, became the main source of government funds, effectively subsidizing the Nigerian government and unofficially its corrupt officials. Additionally, environmental degradation, corruption, and social inequality became pressing issues, casting a shadow on Nigeria's newfound wealth. Multinational corporations created such destruction and chaos in areas such as the once thriving Ogoni community. Poorly maintained pipelines and relentless gas flares led to oil spills, polluting the land, water, and air. Ken Saro-Wiwa, a son of the Ogoni land, couldn't bear to see his people suffer, so he dedicated himself to bringing their plight to the world's attention. Ken Saro-Wiwa was born Kenule Bison Saro-Wiwa in Bori on October 10, 1941, near Port Harcourt, the capital of Rivers State in Nigeria. Ken Saro-Wiwa received his primary education at a native authority school in Bori. Because of his spectacular academic performance, Saro-Wiwa got government scholarships that saw him through Government College Umuahia and the University of Ibadan, two famous institutions that some other notable Nigerian writers, including Chinua Achebe, had also attended. Ken Saro-Wiwa taught briefly at the University of Lagos after graduating in 1965. But he soon left that position to pursue a bureaucratic career and served as a federal administrator for the Bonny Island oil terminal. Nigeria experienced a brutal civil war between 1967 and 1970. During the conflict, Saro-Wiwa supported the government's goal of preventing the state of Biafra from seceding. He gained an appointment as the Commissioner for Education in Rivers State as a reward for his support. However, he left government service in 1973 because he had become a vocal advocate for greater autonomy for the Ogoni people. The Ogoni are a distinct people who have lived in the Niger Delta for more than 500 years, and Ogoni Land is located to the east of Port Harcourt in Rivers State. Traditionally a riverine agrarian community, the Ogoni's economic mainstays are aquatic agricultural production, animal husbandry, and fishing. The Ogoni live in such a close relationship to their land that there is no distinction in the Ogoni language between the name for the people and the name for the land, as Ken Saro-Wiwa was fond of pointing out. Like other riverine peoples in the region, the Ogoni depend on the fertile Niger Delta for every aspect of their livelihood. It is important to stress that politics in Nigeria have historically been dominated by the Yoruba, the Igbo, and Hausa Fulani ethnic majorities. The Ogoni, who are an ethnic minority, have in the past lacked political power and constitutional protections to control their land or wealth. The same can also be said for the other ethnic minority groups in the Niger Delta. Ken Saro-Wiwa quickly became one of the leading voices in the fight against resource exploitation in the Niger Delta and the oppression of the river's people. As he argued, the economic revolution that was unfolding in Nigeria because of oil manifested itself in two distinct yet intertwined ways. Firstly, oil exploration and production devastated the Niger Delta's ecology, affecting every facet of life in the region. Saro-Wiwa pointed out that numerous oil spills, gas flarings, and pipeline failures caused environmental damage that poisoned waterways, killed marine life that the local populations depended on for food, and rendered large swathes of land unusable for agriculture. Secondly, as Saro-Wiwa pointed out, adding to the Ogoni's misery, very little wealth extracted from the oil fields ever returned to the Ogoni in any form of government investment, as an increasingly corrupt Nigerian state diverted funds to other areas of Nigeria, while the officials also lined their own pockets. This state apparatus also increasingly guaranteed oil company rights and systematically dispossessed Ogoni farmland, requiring the oil companies to make only symbolic payments which fell far short of reasonable compensation for the loss of the fertile agricultural lands. By 1970, the living situation in the Ogoni region had deteriorated to the point that a group of Ogoni leaders drafted a petition detailing the hardships that Shell's activities had inflicted on the Ogoni. This group appealed to the military governor of the newly created river state, pointing out all the damages that could be directly attributed to Shell's activities. Just 3 months after the Ogoni leadership sent their petition to the river state governor, one of the most devastating oil spills in Nigerian history occurred at the Bomu oil field in the heart of Ogoni. The resulting spill continued unabated for 3 weeks. As you can probably imagine, this spill wreaked havoc on the surrounding area. Between 1976 and 1996, 7,000 reported spills flooded the Niger Delta region with over 2 million barrels of oil. These spills were the result of both oil industry negligence and third parties rupturing pipelines in order to steal the oil. As I mentioned before, Ken Saro-Wiwa left government service in 1973. He achieved considerable success in that decade in a variety of commercial ventures, including real estate and retail. In the 1980s though, he shifted his focus from business to television production, writing and journalism. He wrote a satirical television series, Basi and Company, which was watched by 30 million Nigerians each week and was reportedly the most popular television show in Africa in its day. This show lampooned the country's get-rich-quick mentality. Ken Saro-Wiwa also published books such as Soza Boy and Forest of Flowers, and he also wrote a regular column for the Lagos Times. In so doing, he managed to gain an audience beyond Nigeria due to his newspaper writing. Saro-Wiwa served in one presidential administration in the late 1980s. But this did not last long, and by the end of the decade, he had come to believe that corruption was an entrenched feature of Nigeria's successive military regimes and that this said state of affairs could not be challenged from within the existing political structure. Around this time, Ken Saro-Wiwa became increasingly preoccupied with the plight of Ogoni land. In the early 1990s, inspired by the global climate crisis movement, Saro-Wiwa founded the movement for the survival of Ogoni People, MOSOP. He used his influence as the producer of Basi and Company to raise funds and awareness for his cause. In a newspaper article for the Sunday Times in 1990 titled "The Coming War in the Delta," he demanded a reallocation of oil money in favor of local people. Saro-Wiwa's efforts culminated in the issuance of the Ogoni Bill of Rights, demanding an environmental cleanup and justice for the Ogoni. Drawn up by MOSOP and approved by the traditional chiefs of 5 Ogoni clans, This Bill of Rights demanded political autonomy for Ogoni land, local control of its economic resources, and protection from further environmental degradation. This symbolically began the non-violent struggle against the Nigerian government and the oil companies. Nigeria's military rulers dismissed the demands, but MOSOP's grievances found a more receptive audience abroad, notably among environmental and human rights groups. MOSOP persisted, and in December of 1992, they wrote to Shell, Chevron, and the state-owned Nigerian National Petroleum Company, the three oil companies operating in Ogoni land, demanding payment of $6 billion for accumulated rentals and royalties for oil exploration dating back to 1958. They also demanded payment of $4 billion for damages and compensation for environmental pollution, as well as negotiations to decide acceptable terms for future oil exploration. The companies were given 30 days to meet these demands and threatened with mass actions if they failed to do so. The time had come, said MOSOP, for the Ogonis to fight for their salvation because there's no government to deliver us. Of the three oil companies, Shell easily had the largest share in the area, and as such was MOSOP's primary target. The Nigerian government, with General Ibrahim Babangida now in power, did not take this lying down, and so it responded by sending troops to protect oil installations and announcing a ban on all public gatherings and demonstrations. The government also issued a decree declaring that demands for self-determination and disruptive activities affecting oil production would be considered acts of treason punishable by death. Defying the threat, on 4 January 1993, MOSOP organized a peaceful protest attended by nearly 300,000 Ogoni people. They not only decried the environmental destruction of their land caused by the oil companies, but they also expressed the Ogoni people's right to self-determination, including greater control over the exploitation of oil found on their lands. Conservative traditional leaders in Ogoni land took fright at this growing confrontation with the government. After an outbreak of violence in April, they issued a statement apologizing for the disorder and supporting a crackdown on dissidents. What this meant was that the Ogoni movement became divided between this conservative faction anxious to reach an agreement with the government and a radical wing of youth activists led by Ken Saro-Wiwa, who were determined to pursue the campaign. The conservative leaders accused Saro-Wiwa of employing an army of trained thugs to ensure that he emerged as the one Ogoni leader. One of the pillars of MOSOP was non-violence, although angry protesters beat one Shell employee in January of 1993. After the January 4 rally and further protests, Shell pulled out of the region. This drastically lowered the amount of petroleum being extracted from the region and cut profits for the oil companies operating in the area by about $200 million in 1993. MOSOP also planned to boycott the upcoming presidential elections slated for June of that year. Now, once Ken Saro-Wiwa and MOSOP announced the planned election boycott, the military government initiated a crackdown on the Ogoni, intending to resume Shell's operations by whatever means necessary. The shots that were fired at 11 protesters on 30 April 1993 and the resulting riots in which one person was killed would mark the first of a series of government-orchestrated paramilitary actions. After the elections of 1993, the government of Ibrahim Babangida intensified their campaign against the Ogoni. On 9 July and again at the beginning of August, hundreds of Ogoni were massacred, first with the attack on an Ogoni group returning from Cameroon along the Andoni River, and weeks later with the razing of the village of Ka at the southern end of Ogoni land. Though the government blamed inter-ethnic warfare between the Ogoni and the Andoni for the massacres, eyewitness accounts disputed that assertion. Some observers even stated that the weapons used, which included mortar and hand grenades, were indicative of a military operation. Ken Saro-Wiwa could not have chosen a more dangerous time to begin his mass movement. Although he directly confronted the Babangida regime in the run-up to the 1993 elections, the election result and Babangida's response to it created a crisis that led to General Sani Abacha taking up power in a coup d'etat later that year. Sani Abacha's rise to power in Nigeria signaled the beginning of an unprecedented period in Nigerian history. According to some estimates, Sani Abacha pilfered up to about £6 billion from Nigerian government coffers, leading to his being named the fourth most corrupt head of government in the 20th century after Suharto of Indonesia, Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines, and Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire. In addition to the blatant corruption, Sani Abacha added a staggering level of state repression. None were more vulnerable to Sani Abacha than those who, like Ken Saro-Wiwa, aimed to challenge the oil industry, Nigeria's main source of income and the source of much of Abacha's stolen wealth. The Abacha regime's brutality was not limited only to the Ogoni or to Ken Saro-Wiwa. Unlike Ibrahim Babangida, Abacha tolerated no political opposition and reacted brutally to suppress any challenge to his sole authority over the country. General Sani Abacha's regime would single out Ken Saro-Wiwa for special consideration because of his success in mobilizing support for the Ogoni cause abroad and especially for the pressure his efforts placed on Shell, which regarded him as a menace and monitored his activities closely. As repression within Nigeria increased, international support and knowledge of the Ogoni struggle continued to grow. Around the same time, dissent within the MOSOP movement had created a divide between its president, Ken Saro-Wiwa, and other movement leaders. The end of the movement came in May of 1994 after 4 conservative leaders meeting in the chief's palace at Gokana were killed by a local mob. Although Ken Saro-Wiwa was not present, he was arrested for allegedly instructing his supporters to deal with his political opponents. 15 other Ogoni leaders were arrested along with Ken Saro-Wiwa. Nobody really knows what transpired on that bloody Saturday, 21 May 1994, because no proper police investigation was conducted and no forensic evidence was offered at the subsequent tribunal. General Sani Abacha's government responded with impunity. In Ogoni land, reports emerged from human rights organizations detailing horrifying accounts of nighttime attacks, extrajudicial killings, torture, and the destruction of homes and livelihoods. Now, the prisoners, including Ken Saro-Wiwa, were held in detention for 9 months without access to lawyers before being charged with incitement to murder. In the meantime, General Sani Abacha created a new tribunal called the Civil Disturbances Special Tribunal, the CDST, and designed it to ensure a guilty verdict. The CDST consisted of 2 judges and a military officer, and the accused were given no right to appeal the court's verdict, even in the case of a death penalty, which was expressly in the tribunal's mandate. By the time Ken Saro-Wiwa and his colleagues were officially charged on January 28, 1995, the court's proceedings were so obviously flawed that it was clear that the group would not be tried fairly. Like I said before, the official charge was incitement to murder. However, Ken Saro-Wiwa denied the charge and no credible evidence was ever produced linking him to the murders. The guilty verdicts were handed down on October 31, 1995 for Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 of his co-defendants: Saturday Dobi, Nodu Iyawo, Daniel Boko, Paul Livera, Felix Nyuate, Barry Bobera, Barry Nemkiobel, and John Puonen, collectively called the Ogoni Nine. The other prisoners were acquitted in what has been termed cosmetic acquittals. After the verdict, some of the prosecution's witnesses admitted to being bribed for their testimony. Within 8 days of the guilty verdict, Sani Abacha's Provisional Ruling Council confirmed the sentence, which was a death sentence. It is said that the day after Abacha confirmed the sentences, 9 coffins were brought to Port Harcourt prison. Wole Soyinka, the Nobel laureate, then in exile, traveled to New Zealand along with Saro-Wiwa's son, Ken Wiwa, on November 9 to persuade the Commonwealth heads of government to pressure General Abacha to commute the death sentence. But all of this was to no avail. Revelations that emerged from a commission that was established many years later, known as the Oputa Panel, shed light on Ken Saro-Wiwa's final hours and how he never believed that General Sani Abacha would confirm his death sentence. According to some sources, Ken Saro-Wiwa regarded General Sani Abacha as a friend. It was recorded that they spent afternoons playing tennis at the 2nd Artillery Brigade in Port Harcourt during the 1970s. Also, very few people thought that General Abacha would risk the potential international backlash that would result from executing the 9 defendants after such a kangaroo court proceeding. Because the prison where the crew were held had not hosted an execution since Nigeria's independence, executioners had to be flown in from northern Nigeria. The executions of the Ogoni Nine took place on 10 November 1995. Though no official account of the execution exists, several prisoners claim to have witnessed the execution. Human rights groups and environmental advocates accused Shell and other oil companies operating in the Niger River Delta of doing little to secure the release of Ken Saro-Wiwa and his supporters, and therefore held them indirectly responsible for their deaths. Nigeria was suspended from the Commonwealth on November 11, the day after the execution. European nations and the United States imposed some sanctions on General Abacha's regime, including travel bans for military and political elites, but stopped short of approving an oil embargo, the one threat that would have crippled the Nigerian government. Unfortunately, these executions marked the beginning of a new chapter in Nigeria's repression of the Ogoni. By the end of 1995, most MOSOP leaders were either killed, jailed, forced underground, or exiled. Meanwhile, Sani Abacha remained indifferent to the barrage of condemnation that came from abroad. The execution of the Ogoni Nine had served its purpose of warning critics of the costs of opposing him. Maintaining his vice-like grip on power, Sani Abacha next turned his attention to obtaining a popular mandate for his rule. His plans, however, were cut short. On June 8, 1998, General Sani Abacha died mysteriously. According to some sources, he died while in the arms of a pair of prostitutes. Although Ken Saro-Wiwa's life ended prematurely on that fateful morning of November 10, 1995, he left an indelible mark on the history of Nigeria. Ken Saro-Wiwa stood up against powerful forces, fought for his people, and ignited a global movement. Don't forget to like and share the video if you enjoyed it. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.